When we talk about post-production, editing is an obvious activity, but there is another one which is also pretty important, and that is color work. Color work is usually divided into color correction and color grading, where color correction is the actions where you are correcting for possible mistakes in how the video was captured color-wise, and color grading is the artistic or stylistic discipline of giving your video a certain stylistic expression. So when we want to work with color correction and color grading, let's just start by changing the workspace. That is not necessary, of course, but there is a predefined workspace where we have some tools that we would be using anyway. And what you can see is that something called Lumetri Color has been added as a panel to the right. And also we have the Lumetri scopes up here in the window, where we can open up and see some curves and stuff that will help us to determine whether the colors are right. So if we start working on a clip like this one, you can see that things that we have available is basic color correction, creative curves, color wheels, and a few other things. In basic correction, we have some standard tools for working with the white balance of a clip, and also exposure, contrast, and stuff like that. In creative, we can apply something like a certain predefined look, like a preset, and there are many different presets, as you can see, for a certain cinematic look. These may not all work on the footage you've got, as they have mainly been created for a video that has been recorded a little bit different than what we have and you have probably been doing. Then we have in the section called curves, we have certain curves here, like the RGB curve, where we can change some color settings as well. Let's start up here in the basic correction and look at the white balance. The white balance, as has been mentioned before, is the reference point for which the software will calculate other colors, where white is light and then all colors are sort of calculated with a reference to them. So here in this image, we could certainly choose this writing here. It looks white, and if I click it, you can see some minor changes over here. We could also try to choose something else, like maybe the yellow, and we would certainly see, if we choose yellow, we get a bluish tint to the whole thing, because now yellow is our white reference point, and that doesn't make sense in a color correction terminology, but maybe you would use that in a color grading if you're going for a very cold look. And of course we could also go here and say, let's take the wall, and now you can see in reference where we still have the image over here to the left, that it looks a little bit sort of colder. The yellow is a little bit sort of less saturated, but the wall looks white, and that might be what we're after. I'll wait a bit doing anything really, so I'll just show a few things here. Exposure means how much light has come into the chip. Now if we give more exposure, it's like we have it could also be like we have a longer exposure time, so that would just mean more light into the chip. So we can simulate something that's been overexposed or underexposed, but it could also be used if we have something that is slightly underexposed, we could add a little bit of exposure. Contrast, if we add a lot of contrast, we'll get this sort of a stronger image, but we have other tools to work with contrast in curves, so I'd rather do that. Then highlight and shadows. If we do have some highlights that we think needs a little less light or more light, we can use that. And the same for shadows. If we need more or less light in our shadows, we can do that. Not too many shadows on this image here, so that's the basic color correction. Now these images here, if I do any changes to this one, they'll probably be the same for this one, because I don't want the wall to be my reference in this one, but then all colors sort of change in that one. I certainly would like the colors to be the same on that picture and this one, and not perhaps even these as well, especially if we have this one where we have a little bit of table. We would want that to be the same as the table on the other clips. So instead of going into all of these, you can see that the panel opens up every time I click a clip. I have the Lumetri color panel for that particular clip. But we could instead, if we go down to this new item here, we could create an adjustment layer, make it the same width and height as the video, and let's call it color correction layer. Now this color correction layer we could add to an empty track, and I think I just moved the clip away, so now this is completely an empty track. If you need more tracks, just add more tracks. But now we can take this adjustment layer and we can drag it out to cover the entire movie, and that means that any changes we would do on our color correction would apply to all clips. Now this is great if, like mine here, you have all clips in the same location and they're all indoor. But if you have outdoor clips and you have 3 different locations, you may need 3 different adjustment layers, and I could call mine something like kitchen. So that's correction layer for any kitchen clips that we have. And certainly you could apply, you could place it wherever you want, so it doesn't have to be from the beginning. But here it's nice and convenient. I can just expand it to cover the entire movie. Let's go back. Now it's the color correction layer that we have, the adjustment layer here that is activated. So let's open up this basic correction again. I will try to pick the wall. Now I get a sort of a dimmer, a little bit more grayish look to it, and I can look through my clips. Now if I take the adjustment layer off, we can see the original, and now with the adjustment layer, which means with the white balance, this is the version with the white balance, and this is without the layer, so this is the original. And we can see that they're much warmer originally, and this perhaps is a little bit more true to nature. I mean, every image is cheating, so we are always trying to get colors to, and we also see colors sort of, our brains are very good at adjusting. So even if you're in a dim light situation, you would normally be able to recognize what colors things are. Cameras of course are different, so they will just record what they can, and then we'll have to adjust to get the right expression. So we always look for an expression, but this is with the adjustment layer, and this is without the adjustment layer. Now you might sort of think, oh, without, or it actually looks better without the adjustment layer. It's a bit warmer, it's a bit nicer, but we'll work with that later. First of all, we want to get something close to correct as we can. And then here we have this this clip here, and they also look fairly right, but maybe the shadows are a little bit dark. So we could try to say, what if we took the shadows and added a little bit of information or light to the shadow areas? Well, actually quite a bit here. not too much, because then it becomes washed out. But this is without and this is with, so just make that a little bit sort of closer to where we can see what's going on in these dark areas. And then of course I'll have to go back and see if that destroyed everything. Now remember, about 40 and without. So I'm not completely satisfied with let me just get this with this here. Actually this is without the shadows and this is lightening of the shadows, so we can look in the kitchen sink here and see what is going on. We get a little bit more light down there, but then again, so instead of just, we could add a little bit of shadow light in this one, but then of course we could go to these images and say, well, we'll add the shadow light to each of these. So this is the one to the right, and here is without, so this is what I need, and this is the other one. So how much do that need? Not as much perhaps. Alright, so now I've added a little bit of shadow light to these two video clips, but not to the rest, and not as much to the adjustment layer. So already you can see that we have here in this situation we would have the clip itself having a changed value, and then we would have the adjustment layer that have another value and a white balance setting. So that's that part. I don't want to do contrast here, so let's just close this basic correction and go down to curves. Now this one is interesting because we can actually set, and we have to understand how this is to read this curve here. This is, top is light, bottom is dark, and this is taking our blacks, and right now the line is saying throughout the dynamic range of the image we have top light and bottom dark, and we are using the entire span of this image. If we take this dark one and move it to the right, you can see that the end point for the darkest part is changed. So now we are effectively limiting the dynamic range, but that also means that there's not as much space left in that range for dark and light. So if you can see that we can make it brighter with saying we're not really using that part up here, so let's move the limit of where the values go. So effectively by this we have added some contrast to the image. So if we just move them out again, we can see that this is the corrected version, and then we are adding a little bit of contrast by limiting, or actually we are saying this part is not used of the image and this part should not be used. So what before was expanded throughout the entire dynamic range should only go from this value to this value, effectively strengthening the perception of dark and light. We can try to take out curves, and by just clicking here and adding it again, and you can see it's a little stronger image, more contrast, but we still have the correct white. Let's choose another image with the curves, no, without the curves, and now with the curves. Now another thing you can do here, let's add it in, is you can just click here and you'll add a point, and there's something called the S curve, which is adding a little bit of light and taking away a little bit of dark. So the S curve actually works very close to what contrast would do. So you can also see here without the curves now, it's a little sort of more grayish, and with it becomes stronger, and certainly the contrast of the lines are stronger in the image. Now you can actually continue this and say that the entire image should be, whenever you put in these curves here, these points, of course they would stay where you've put them, but we could take these and say, okay, we want the S curve to take place somewhere down here. Let's see if we can make that an S curve, and you would change the expression of the image. Now I'm going into color correction now, so I don't want to do that right now. So let's just move this one back up here, and this one there, and this one back only slightly, a slight S curve to strengthen the contrast. Let's see with the curves, without the curves. So here it's certainly a strong effect. Here is with, and here is without. So again, it's becoming a stronger image, and sometimes, well, you can certainly see on the metal that it becomes sort of more metally, more bright metally kind of feel to it. And here with the curves now and without, so with that extra contrast here, we actually got a little bit maybe too much. So this thing that we did with maybe too much for this end image, I'll just see if I can adjust it a little bit so it's not as bad. This is more, that's a slight change, but it's still a change. Let's just go back and see if that still works on the other clips that we have, like the first clip. Oops, let me just open that one. It's certainly, oops, I've clicked the wrong one, so that's why it was making being weird. I clicked the actual clip. I need to click the adjustment layer. So there's still an effect, and it's still contrast, and I'll say that I'm happy with this for now. So I'll leave this adjustment layer, and instead I'll go down and create another adjustment layer, and call this one color grading. So color grading, I'll just add here, and if you noticed, I just placed it there, and Premiere automatically gave me a new video track, so that's pretty neat. So here we have color correction layer, and then we have color grading layer on top. We can take this one away, and then we can take this one away, but we haven't done anything to the color grading layer yet. So let's try to go into creative and see if we can use one of the predefined looks. Let's say SL Blue Eyes makes it kind of bluish, the whole thing. So that's one look you could go for if you don't want to create your own. Or we could say clean straight LDR, so that's a different look. And all sort of kind of, in a way you could say they're trying to emulate something cinematic. But all these looks actually works best if we had been filming using a proper profile in our camera. So in your camera you can set different profiles. For if you have a DSLR camera, you can typically set different profiles, and they are profiles that has in camera while recording. They are recording with something of a flatter image, with less where the dynamic range is set up a little bit different, so that they look flat and dimmed, because that would leave you more room to work in post-production. But That doesn't happen on a mobile phone, and I don't expect that you've been setting your your profiles. So therefore, we would just work with our own. But in Creative, you can try these looks, and if it works for you, that's absolutely fine. You can use those. But of course, we could also use something like that's predefined for us already, like faded film. I mean, stuff like this is always sometimes it's because it's becoming popular and many sort of wish for this. You could just make faded film, but if it's just a slider in Premiere, it also becomes overused and perhaps a little bit boring. But taking away some sharpness, let's just see, sharpness, a lot of this faded film, take away a little bit of the vibrance of it, but oversaturate. And let's see if we have something with some colors in it. Now you can see that we have a completely different look from the original, and that is in the color grading world. Now we have a certain cinematic feel to it. That's not really what I'm going for here, so I'll just undo these changes. But they are possibilities you can work with. Still in color correction work, let's open up the curves again, because I also want to look into the Lumetri scopes over here. The Lumetri scopes, if you open them up, you can see a little bit of sort of, it's not easy to see what's going on at first. If we move our marker here, we can see that they are dynamically updated and they actually correspond exactly to what's going on in the image. At least they are on a horizontal scale. Over here you can actually see this this spoon coming down, but it's not the spoon as such. It's each vertical line of pixels in the original footage will be translated over here. So each vertical line here will be a vertical line here, but it's not that this pixel will be represented by this light value, because here on the y-axis we have black at 0 and white at 100. So this is actually the dynamic range we have available of light. And what is happening here is that how much blue light, red light, green light and light in general, chroma, is actually available, shown in this particular column. And then column by column we can see that going on. Now this one can be a little bit sort of difficult to look at, so there are other options if you go into this one. This is called the waveform. I cannot unclick this until I've clicked another one. We could also look at the parade, for example, and then we could take the waveform away. This is actually the waveform just split up in 3 different colors. So now you can see, if we move the image here, you can now see the same thing going on, but in 3 different colors. So now the red actually expands all the way from left to right in the image, so it's a little bit squashed here. I mean, we could go down to this and we get a little bit more room. It looks like blue is more represented than red and green. That means that we can go over here and say, let's look at the blue and drag it down a bit and see where we want it. We want it to be as represented as the other colors, actually perhaps all the way down to 90. So, and then we'll take the green, because that seems to be a little overrepresented in relation to the red. Take that a little bit down as well. And notice what happened in the clip. Let's take without it and with it. This is with, so that now the this white here actually looks a little bit whiter than before, whereas now you can perhaps you can recognize when we do this on and off thing that it's more bluish, and when I add these curves it looks a little bit better. And this is because our eyes and our monitors are not necessarily the best tools in color correction, because we adapt colors with our eyes, our perception of colors with our brains. So they play tricks on us in that sense, and our monitors can be calibrated differently, and they may not even be calibrated correctly for this work. So don't always trust monitors and eyes. You have to look at the scopes as well, where we can see that now red is a little bit well, it's more or less the same as the others, and that is giving us a better image. Perhaps if we go to another image, this one, actually it looks a little bit better. If I take this off, you can see that blue and green were also overrepresented in this image. So this may be something that my phone did. And even in this image, if I take them away, oops, I was actually doing this in my color grading. I should probably be doing this in my color correction layer, but never mind. I could call it color correction layer 2, because what I can do, I can take this layer entirely away and add it again. And if I take it away, you can see blue and green is stronger. And if I take it, if I add it, we see the adjustment that we did. So it's certainly better now. Most clips are balanced, and that seems fine. Maybe there's a little bit extra blue here, but perhaps that would be hard to do in an adjustment layer, because if I adjusted this clip with the adjustment layer, I would also change all the others, unless of course I make an adjustment layer that just is placed here. Let's just stick with this. Now for this movie I would like to do a little bit of color grading as well. But let's just have a look at so if instead of the parade scope here, we use, let's say, the vector scope, where we can see some representation of the saturation from center and out, more saturation. And here we have sort of a line of valid values. We can see if any of our clips are too saturated, and if we want to change that, we could go into the hue saturation curves and look at one of these. Perhaps if we take this one and try to move a little bit of this particular color section a bit down, you can see that we can get it more saturated or less. So we could work with these fairly slightly to see if our curves are right. Now detailed work like this actually would be better to do on the clips themselves, or at least have an adjustment layer that you would split up, so it would be all the same types of clips. For example, all the clips with this bowl in it, but that would take me too long. So it might not have changed anything here, because you can see in the image you can't really see any difference, but in the curve you can see a slight change when we remove or add it. So it didn't do any damage to those clips. If we change this, there's not enough of a change to see it. So here we can actually see saturation getting the stronger the saturation is, the wider we see the blob here is in the middle, and we can adjust for that. So if you dig into this, you can see there are several different ways. There are even presets you can use, and we also have, like in the Parade, we have different color models that we can use, like the YUV, and the same for the waveform. If we go and have a look at the waveform, we can also change the type into only be concerned with light and not the colors. So here we have separated colors and then light. So all of this is combined will be the tools that you'll be working with, and the ones that you might end up being working with the most is probably Parade, or even the waveform, perhaps having the light there. Depending on the size of your screen, you might also want to ditch that one. And then of course using the Lumetri colors over here to do different correction work. At this point we want to go back and see if we are ready to do a little bit of color grading. So for that I will open up my RGB curves and go into, let's say, the red. And let's start with this one and say, what happens if we take now wait a minute, actually what I did here, when I actually promised I would do color grading in that one, I did actually more correction. So let's just do it properly. Correction layer 2, and then we'll create a new one where we will do color adjustment layer. Okay, and then we will call it color grading, so I'm not confusing myself completely. So I'll just add this one up here. So now we have a proper color grading adjustment layer in which we can go completely crazy. So let's start with changing it from normal to something of a negative feel. It's not completely negative though, but it's changed light and dark. So that is of course something which is an artistic expression. We could also do that for the colors, so that we can reverse certain colors, and by this you can see that you can change colors as well. But I wasn't thinking about doing anything this drastic. I was thinking about doing a little bit about the red. So what happens if we go this way? You can see now, as with the light, we can strengthen the red contrast, or the dark and lights maximums of red, by using this, and we can even do an S-curve on the red to see if we can strengthen something here. There's a tendency to go over the top all the time. This now has less red in the dark areas and more red in the lighter areas. If we want the red to be emphasized overall, we could do something like this. So this is without and with. If we want the whole thing to be sort of a stronger, we could try to make it a stronger contrast throughout the entire movie. And let's just go back to the red here and see if we are satisfied with this. So now I've created a curve. This is clearly too much, but now I can take a little bit of that blue down, because I'm looking at the scopes now. I'm taking the blue down a bit, and then of course it looks a little bit greenish, so I'll take that down as well. But that was too much. but it certainly has gotten a red feel to it. So if we go back to this red here and we just, it becomes almost pink, and that's not what I want, but something like this perhaps. Let's just look at some clips. If I just play it, you can see that if we watch this and we haven't seen anything before, we would recognize the colors, we would recognize the environment, we wouldn't think too much about everything being, or perhaps that clip perhaps, but many of the others, we wouldn't think too much about this being weird, because we would immediately adjust. But if I take it away, we can immediately see that it's quite different with this these adjustments applied. And that's kind of the point, that when we apply these changes, what we're going for is that without, you can see we have a fairly sort of neutral representation, but with, we want to create something with a lot of warmth in it. So we take away some blue and we add some red, but perhaps we also need to add a little bit of green, but that may become too much. We don't want it to be green, we don't want it to be pink either. So these adjustments is something where you can go in and you can play more. You can create, if you take some of the blue away, you would often recreate something that looks like old home movie, because many of the celluloid films have degraded since they were made, and therefore they look a little bit redder. So creating something like this makes the meat very strong and in your face, whereas this is the neutral one and the color graded one. We can still recognize it, but now it looks a little bit sort of maybe even old-fashioned or something. But these clips without looks more neutral and natural, and therefore we haven't put any attitude in it. But if we create this version, there's a lot of attitude in the colors. When you watch any movie, Netflix, cinema, whatever, there will be color grading added to the movie as part of the post-production process. And it's not really cheating, it's simply saying what kind of feel is there in the overall video, what is the theme of the video, and how can we add this a slight touch or a help for the viewer to actually understand the theme. So if the theme here is a debate about meat, then the meat should look very meaty and not necessarily just neutral, but we want to look at it more drawn into it with strong colors, saturated, so that it's emphasized that this is what we are looking at. Actually, in this movie, the meat, okay, this clip here is a bit wild, so that would be too much. We could dim it down, as you can see, but then of course we're dimming everything down. If we go, we can easily make it weird and fun, but we have to go for something that is reasonable in the other clips as well. You don't have to do everything in an adjustment layer. Now the meat has become too dark, so now we have put in an attitude that it's almost rotten or something, at least when we look at it here. Not necessarily here though. So perhaps some of the clips we would have to go in and redo those adjustments per clip, and then slightly adjust them so it looks nice and delicious, whereas or you would want it to be dark and or sort of not so delicious. So color grading is not something that you have to do for this project, but it's something that will often be done and it will add a certain amount of finish to your film. The most important part, of course, will be to do color correction. So taking away the color grading. If you do color correction and you get it as neutral and natural as possible, that is fine. That's good. That's what you should do. And then most people find it kind of fun to make at least one color graded version of their final video, and then you can see if you can find something that makes it, without people knowing that you've messed with the colors, you get them to feel, oh, here's a warm day. If you have good feelings, you have warmth, you have a slight adjustment to the red so it becomes warmer, and if people are sad, you'll have a slight adjustment towards blue. I mean, these are something that we will usually we will not realize that we are seeing it, but we will recognize it in our minds. So that's something to consider. Alright, try it out, see what you can make happen, but focus mainly for your project, focus mainly on color correction.